Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our March webinar at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Rohini Bajekal. I'm a nutritionist and communications lead at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. And this March is exactly 5 years since we launched our webinar program right at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I really want to thank all of you who have joined many of our webinars before and also welcome those of you who are new. It gives me great pleasure to announce the speaker for this evening. This is something we've really looked forward to for a long time, and I will be introducing Professor Gary Fraser shortly, who's going to be talking about neurologic and other chronic disease mortality in US vegetarians and non-vegetarians. And hopefully you've read the paper from the Adventist Health Study-2 that I included in the meeting link, but do have a look, and I'll be resharing that in the chat as well for those who haven't had a look at that. I also want to flag that we have a new episode of In a Nutshell, our Plant-Based Health Professionals UK official podcast this week, and it's featuring the wonderful gastroenterologist, Dr. Alan Desmond, who's one of our ambassadors, talking about fibre, plant-based diets, and diverticulitis. So please do go check that out, share it, leave a review. And last but not least, if you haven't already, do get your ticket for our in-person and virtual conferences for the Nutrition and Lifestyle Medicine Conference. We've already confirmed incredible keynote speakers such as Dr. Nicola Gass and a glucose expert, and you can visit nrmc.org.uk and our Eventbrite page to get your ticket. I'll share that in the chat. So Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, we're a community interest group dedicated to promoting the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet for prevention, management, and sometimes treatment of chronic health conditions alongside conventional treatments. And we're very grateful to have CPD accreditation for these webinars. This webinar will be submitted for CPD accreditation, and if granted, you'll receive a copy of the slides and CPD certificate in your inbox in around 3 weeks' time. And it's also valid for CME accreditation from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. And lastly, a reminder to support our work and our advocacy if you would like to see the promotion of healthy, plant-rich diets in healthcare as well as in other areas. The best way to do this is by joining us as a member. This is open to everyone around the world, not just health professionals, and it costs as little as £15 per year for students, £25 per year for general membership. And we also have regular newsletters, and we're on social media and Substack as well if you want to check out the latest news on plant-based health. And we do share our latest studies in there as well. So now I'd like to welcome Professor Gary E. Fraser. He's pioneered research in vegetarian and plant-based diets for nearly 4 decades and led the landmark Adventist Health Studies, which we're all familiar with, which has over 96,000 participants. He's also published or been featured in more than 300 peer-reviewed publications and has received over $30 million of NIH funding for his work. And his qualifications span medicine, cardiology, and epidemiology. So don't miss today's webinar. If you enjoyed this webinar, then recordings are for our members only. But as I mentioned, we really do welcome everyone. So I'd love to welcome Professor Gary. Let me just help you start the video, Gary, because I did tell you to minimize that when we started. That should work now. Wonderful. And Professor Gary Fraser is joining us from New Zealand as well. I believe it's Auckland, is that right?
Close to Auckland, yes.
Close to Auckland right now, where you spent half the day, which we're hearing more about in the Q&A. And so do share your burning questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen rather than the chat box. And so we can ask all our questions in the interactive Q&A. So very best of luck, and we're incredibly honored to have you here. So thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Regina. Well, let me just open my presentation. Any luck? All right, well, good morning from me, good evening to you from New Zealand. And I'm not going to focus quite as much on neurology as perhaps the title suggests, because we don't have a lot of information there, but as you'll see later, what we have is quite intriguing and certainly is worth some comment. But rather a more general focus on aging and disorders of aging. First of all, I'd like to spend a few minutes for those of you who are perhaps more technically inclined, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but as you may know, nutritional epidemiology is a very challenging discipline for a number of reasons. And a number of these I've listed here. First of all, when we're thinking about chronic disorders such as cancer, probably dementia, a number of other things, randomized trials of diet, for instance, and most lifestyles are really not possible. For instance, how likely do you think it would be, or what kind of people would agree to be randomized to either a vegan diet or a non-vegetarian diet and stick with it for 15 or 20 years? You see, it's very, very difficult. So we're stuck with what we call observational studies or cohort studies, which is what Adventist Health Study-2 is. Secondly, the measurement of diet is difficult. I mean, how many times did you eat carrots on average per week in the last 1 year? Was it 2.5 or 3.5 or 1? You know, see what I'm saying? And there are systematic errors and also just random errors that can creep into responses to dietary questionnaires. Then there's the myriad of foods and phytochemicals, hundreds, possibly thousands. And this results in a good dietary questionnaire typically being quite long and tedious. Another problem is that during the follow-up of a longitudinal or prospective study, we cannot reestablish diet information, say, every year. And so we have a follow-up maybe of 8 or 9 years, and maybe we only have, as we had, dietary information at the beginning of the study, and yet people, particularly younger people, do tend to change their diet. We have established in our population that the older folks, those, should I say 50 or 60, where most of the endpoints are coming from, actually have very stable diets over time. And the other problem is, does duration of diet really matter? How long have you been, for instance, a vegetarian, which is one of the focuses that we're going to deal with today? Well, just very quickly, what are some of the partial solutions to these problems? The randomized controlled trials are not possible. And by the way, there are problems with those as well. But with prospective longitudinal work, we aim to approximate the results of such trials. And a book called The Question of Why by Pearl and McKenzie is worth a read if you're really interested in this. Talks about measurement errors and how one can take care of those appropriately with adjustment in longitudinal observational work. Then there's the fact of these measurement errors, and I'm not going to get technical here, but first of all, it's very important that one tries to validate the food frequency questionnaire that we so often use. To have a smaller subgroup where you have a better kind of measurement of the diet. For instance, we had about 1,000 people that gave us 6 24-hour recalls of what they'd eaten in the last 24 hours. And then there's an analytic method called regression calibration, which needs very careful planning. And we can come back to that in the Q&A if anyone is interested, but we did use that in our work that requires, again, a calibration sub-study. Then there's the multitude of foods and phytochemicals that are out there, and we are helped here by recognizing the value of basic science research and in suggesting a priori dietary candidates for further study. And one needs to remember that one should adjust for other foods. For instance, if you are focusing on a particular food, such as dairy, for instance, it's possible that dairy eaters are also more likely to be non-vegetarians or to consume eggs. So if you only look at dairy, it may be carrying the baggage of other foods that it's correlated with. And the only way to get around that problem is to adjust for those other foods. And then there now are high-dimensional statistical analytic strategies that allow us to test the whole lot together in a defensible way. We used to call that a fishing expedition. Now we know how to fish in an appropriate way. And the long, complex dietary questionnaires, it helps to choose your population carefully. A group maybe who's interested in diet and is likely to be compliant, and yet who are biologically still going to be representative of the whole population. We need to fully pre-test the questionnaires, and these days one is expected to have online versions. In terms of changing diets, it's important to know what is the distribution of duration of the diet. People who are vegan now, were they vegan 2 years ago? That might be important. And because many vegetarians do tend to be transient. And does the duration really matter? Yes, for sure it must. For cardiovascular risk factors and perhaps cardiovascular disease, changes can be quicker, but for many other endpoints, we think that these things take decades to develop. So on to our Adventist Health Study-2 that we call AHS2 for short. It's a traditional cohort design. As mentioned, it was funded by the National Institutes of Health in the United States, run from Loma Linda University in California. The enrollment period for the people, the 96,000, was 2002 to 2007. About 25,000 of these were African American, only smaller numbers Hispanic and Asian. These were enrolled from across the United States and Canada, and all these people were Seventh-day Adventists. And I'll share with you just why we did that in a moment. We did have a validation study of about 1,000 subjects who, as I mentioned, gave the 6 structured 24-hour dietary recalls, and we're published extensively on the validity of our food frequency questionnaire. So how does a typical cohort study work? We measure at the study baseline, the beginning, diet and other habits. Then we follow up people, typically for 10, even 20 years, and collect new cases of disease. And then at the end of this time, we can compare the rates of new disease, say between vegetarians and non-vegetarians, or those who exercise or those that don't, those that are overweight, those who are not, and so on and so forth. So we can look at interesting contrasts in disease rates during this follow-up period. Why choose Adventists? Well, it turns out that only about half in the United States are vegetarian. So a plant-based diet is recommended, but it's not mandated. And this actually sets up a rather wonderful natural experiment, which to some extent is why I have spent my professional life trying to take advantage of this kind of work. These people are not cigarette smokers, and there's little or usually no alcohol consumption, which is useful because these can be confounding or confusing variables if you don't take them into account in some way. And also, Adventists are generally interested in good health and care of their bodies. This is thought of as a religious virtue. So with that in mind, we have about 4 or 5 different dietary categories, which I'm going to talk more about in the next few slides. About 8% of our population were vegan, so that's about 7,000 people. It's far and away the largest study of vegans, as far as I know, in the world. About 28% were lacto-ovo-vegetarians. That means they can consume dairy and eggs, but no other flesh foods. The vegans, by the way, you probably know, no animal products. Then there's about 10% were what we call pesco-vegetarians. The only flesh foods they consume are fish. Semi-vegetarians, I'll skip. We're not going to say much about them. And then the main comparison group is the nearly half of these people who consume flesh foods aside from fish at least once a week. Having said that, it's important to point out that these non-vegetarians tend to be relatively low meat consumers, probably on average about 3 times a week, and some of that is poultry, of course. So it means that the comparison that we're going to come back to several times here between these different vegetarian categories and non-vegetarian Adventists is a pretty tough comparison, because even our reference group, they're not heavy into the red meat for sure. So in this study, the ages of enrollment, they had to be at least 30 years of age. Our oldest was 109. Her 91-year-old daughter helped to fill out the questionnaire because her eyesight wasn't so good. The dietary data was gathered at baseline by a food frequency questionnaire. It was long, along with diet, a good deal of other information. In total, it was 50 pages. It took people 1.5 to 3 hours to complete. I've mentioned that we validated it carefully. We also have blood collected and stored on about 2,700 subjects. Follow-up for disease events during about a 10 to 12-year follow-up was for new cancers, and the US has mandated cancer registries in every state, and we made agreements with these state cancer registries in every state except for the state of Maine. The follow-up actually was 2002, 2012 for cancers to this point. Follow-up for deaths is repeatedly matching with an electronic database of deaths, which is, again, a federal thing and is called the National Death Index. We are right now in the midst of starting a follow-up for clinical events and mortality by matching to Medicare data, which is a federally funded kind of health insurance program for everyone over the age of 65, and about 44,000 of our subjects are part of that. And mostly, I point out that we're comparing Adventists to other Adventists. Comparing Adventists to non-Adventists would open the way to other confounding by a number of other variables, perhaps, but mostly we're comparing here Adventists to other Adventists who choose to live their lives a little differently. So some of the more interesting results have to do with total mortality and the blue zone idea, heart attacks and nut consumption, dairy, particularly with respect to breast and prostate cancer, omega-3 fatty acids, and stroke. And then we're going to look at the causes of deaths and just a little bit about metabolic profiles. Just to mention a little bit what do survival curves look like. We're going to talk a bit about those. So you can see here that the right-hand survival curve, 1980, most people there are surviving through to the ages of 60 or 70, which is on the x-axis at the bottom of the page. You can see there by the age of 70, there's still about 85% are surviving. Whereas if you come down to the left-hand curve there, the 1840, you can see that many more people were dying earlier in life. And by the age of 70, only about 25% were surviving. So this is how these curves work. Here's a curve we constructed comparing the Adventist Health Study population, actually of a previous study just in California of 34,000 Adventists with the general California population. And you can see that the Adventist population, this is for men, the whole curve has shifted to the right, which means that more are surviving longer. And to put some numbers on that, the percentage of males, and if you come down to the red highlights, on the left there, surviving to the age of 85 is nearly 20% in the United States, but 40% California Adventist men, and of those who are vegetarians, nearly 50%. And you can see the corresponding figures look even more dramatic in some ways for the woman, how many are surviving to age 85, many, many more Adventists than their neighbors who were non-Adventists in California. We published also some other work looking at this a little differently, where right over to the right-hand side, this gets a score of 1, the vertical line there, and that is for a US census population. So this is one of the rare events we're comparing Adventists to non-Adventists. And if we give the non-Adventists, the census population, a score of 1, you can see where the Adventists sit for all-cause mortality, which is at the top of the slide, cancer mortality, and then other causes of mortality. And you can see in every case, the curves and the error bars sit far to the left for the Adventists. And this is Adventist Health Study-2. These are people that come from across the US. So the census population, this was conducted by the Census Department, by the way, the analysis of this, and adjusted for gender, smoking, education, and region of residence. You might say, well, these people are living longer. Are they living better? And just very quickly, the black lines here, this is questions that have to do with quality of life, standard questions. The US norms are in the black, and you can see at every age. This is for physical health, the Adventist black and white, which are the green and orange lines sit above the black. For mental health, this is for women, the same is true. In men, physical health, mental health. So one can claim that not only the Adventists are living longer, they're living better. Now I'd like to turn to another common disorder of aging, particularly, and this is cancer. And this is not mortality. These are incident cancers, comparing vegetarians to non-vegetarians. So here, these are all Adventists, and the line here, this one, is the non-vegetarian Adventists. And so you can see that the vegetarian Adventists, for most of these causes of cancer, are hanging to the left of the score for the non-vegetarian Adventists. And I've just highlighted in yellow those sites which appear to be significant. And we are challenged here, of course, as studies always are, when we break down with this granularity to the relatively small number of cancers at particular sites. But you can see for stomach cancer, for colon cancer, colorectal, lymphoma, lymphoprolific, and if we put all the medium frequency cancers together, and also for the total cancers, our vegetarian Adventists are doing better than their non-vegetarian counterparts. The blue are sites which were nearly significant and are relatively small numbers, and that could be the cause. We don't know for sure. If we break that down a little further, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We find some additional things that are interesting. What we're doing here, these are younger people. I'm sorry, these are the vegans here. These are the lacto-ovo vegetarians, and these are the pesco vegetarians. And these are each in comparison to the non-vegetarians. And you can see that a couple of other things pop up, particularly for the vegans. For the vegans, and particularly the younger vegans, which is the top line, that they have significantly less breast cancer than the non-vegetarians. And the same thing for prostate cancer. Just the vegans have significantly less than the non-vegetarians. If you look at the lactose in both of these, breast and prostate, nothing's going on. And the same is true for the pescos. It's just the vegans, and we'll come back to that. Breast and prostate, hormone responsive cancers. So now I just want to spend a moment on 2 or 3 individual food groups rather than looking at dietary patterns such as the vegans and so forth, as we have been. So we were actually the first study to publish on nut consumption, a fatty food, which at the time, in the 90s, most nutritionists thought were unhealthy. And to our surprise, to some extent, we found that when we related nut consumption rates to heart disease, we found a significant negative association. And I could say much more, but this just shows the pattern that we found. However, we looked at this relationship that the higher nut consumers had lower rates of heart attack. And this has been now demonstrated in a number of other cohort studies. More recent work that we've been looking at is looking at omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids and the risk of fatal stroke. We're hopefully going to be doing some work on non-fatal stroke and the Medicare data shortly. But what we see here is that if we only have omega-3 in the model, not the other fats, there seems to be about a 25% reduction when we compare extreme quintiles. Actually, the 90th to the 10th extreme 10th percentiles. And if we look at the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and this is not only long-chain omega-3, it includes alpha-linolic acid, we find then, again, a significant relationship suggesting that maybe the omega-6 is deleterious and omega-3 is preventive. If we put both of these in the model together, omega-3 and omega-6, it does seem to uncover a relationship of that sort, which is interesting. And we need to dig further into this. The idea that omega-3s, even including alpha-linolenic, which is the medium chain, could be preventive, and the omega-6 perhaps not so much. Now, just very quickly, a look at dairy, which is very interesting in our data. And notice this is dealing with breast cancer and dairy intake, dairy milk actually. And you can see here that this is a log scale. So even by out here, we're only at a quarter a cup a day. And this is generally very long-term habits in these people. And even by a quarter cup or a half cup, there's about a 50% increase in our data and risk of breast cancer. And this is highly statistically significant. We did a regression calibration as well, which is the pink area. And you see again that with that, which is probably a more accurate result, the calibrated result, the impact of dairy milk seems to be even greater. And we did note that when we looked at cheese or yogurt, we did not find a significant signal. We also, for those statisticians who might be listening, did splined analyses, which did confirm the curvy nature of this if we hadn't put it on a log scale here. And interestingly, when we look at prostate cancer, and we did not put it on a log scale, the breast would have looked the same way very much if we had not put it on a log scale. We find that the curvy nature of this is unpacked. And again, we did a spline curve here with knots as shown, and this confirms the non-linearity. And again, highly statistically significant that we seem to show that at relatively low doses of dairy, in this case, dairy and dairy milk, that there was an increased risk of significant degree in risk of prostate cancer. It's almost like some biochemical pathway becomes saturated at about a cup a day. The risk stays high, but does not get any higher. So that's an interesting twist. Again, we did not find that cheese or yogurt, for those of you who are cheese lovers, had a significant, clear adverse impact. Now, kind of towards the end of the fresh presentations, we also have recently published, as was mentioned, on deaths in relation to vegetarian dietary patterns, and particularly causes of death. And you can see that we had a pretty large number of deaths, in total 12,000 over about 13, 15 years of follow-up, about 1,000 in the vegans and many more in the lactose because it was a bigger population, and about 5,500 in the non-vegetarians. So good numbers here. And I just point out, without taking time to go through all of it, that everything I'm going to show you from here on is extensively adjusted for covariates. We did our best to take care of anything that may be confounding this. Also point out that the analysis allows us to make mortality comparisons at different ages. In fact, we had to look at that because there is a proportional hazards assumption that we need to look at. And sometimes that was violated, and which meant that we had to look at 2 different ages. And where necessary, we have done that. So what did we find? So this here is again the same kind of model that the vertical line given a score of 1 is the non-vegetarian Adventists. I've split everything for each cause of death here, and this is on the death certificate as either the underlying cause or a contributing cause on the American death certificate, and the deaths around age 65 and 85. Now, this is a modeled situation. It's not only taking only those deaths at age 65 and only at those at 85, which would be a small number, but it's modeling where they were on a curve that included the age as an interaction term. So you can see here that as compared to the non-vegetarians, at both younger and older ages at death, deaths from renal failure were markedly lower in the vegetarians. For infectious disease in the younger people, that was true, and much of that was pneumonia, of course. Deaths attributed to diabetes, big differences. Select cardiac disorders, which included heart failure and ischemic heart disease and cardiomyopathy predominantly. If we focused only on ischemic heart disease, the same kind of things. But look what happened here, and we're not used to seeing this. If we focus mainly on the older people, those at age deaths in the 80s, what we're seeing here is the appearance of possibly an adverse effect when we're looking at stroke, dementia, other neurological diseases, and Parkinson's disease. Not so clear on deaths at the younger ages, but in the older ages, something is going on here which we have not seen in the past. And if we split this out to look at the different kinds of vegetarian diet in relation to these disorders and non-vegetarians as a comparison group, again, for younger ages, we find all of the same things we've found for protection that we've just seen, and kind of a mix of things in the neurological causes. When we turn to deaths in the 80s, again, we still find that they are protected from cardiovascular and diabetes and renal failure and so forth. But look what happens up here. This is interesting stuff. We don't know what's going on, and we have to explore this further, and indeed we will. Just one thing very quickly here. We have also done some work in metabolomics, asking the question, well, okay, the vegetarians and particularly the vegans seem different to the non-vegetarian Adventists. Can we dig a little deeper into the basic science roots of this and start to talk about maybe mechanisms in a very rough kind of way? So we did some work with a metabolomics platform that had 930 metabolites, and to our surprise, using very careful statistical techniques with a false discovery rate of about 5%, we found that more than 500 of these metabolites differed significantly between the vegans in this case and the non-vegetarians. And if we look at the 40 that were most differentially expressed, these particularly came from areas that included lipids, amino acids, and xenobiotics. I might say we've also looked at DNA methylation, and they're in the middle of doing that again. These are expensive tests. It's hard to afford more than a few hundred of our subjects who were randomly selected to represent these dietary categories, but it's a different kind of analysis, and we still have pretty good statistical power, particularly for the metabolomics with only a few hundred. So I'm going to finish with 3 or 4 slides here of recommendations and conclusions that, and you'll see here that some recommendations, I've said ordered from more to less secure. Now you might say, well, what business have I got talking about less secure? Well, it seems to me that that's what we've got to do. This is a tough area of research. If we wait till all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, we'll all be dead. So one has to take advantage of the best information we have, I think, and one can do that. So where I start is where I think things are very secure, less secure as I go along. So plant-based diets are definitely preferred for a longer, healthier life. If you're a vegan, or even if you're an older lacto-ovo-vegetarian, perhaps, be sure you supplement with B12. Regular nut consumption, it's pretty clear in that it helps prevent cardiovascular disease. We also, I think, are fairly secure that a mix of plant proteins is healthful. Most plant fats in moderation are healthful. There's not too many of them are saturated. Plant carbohydrates, however, are perhaps a little too easy to consume in large amounts, and be a little careful there. Treat dairy milk with caution. Our data on breast cancer is not unique, but the data is very mixed there, but very few studies have had the capacity to look down at that low end of intake as we have, and where the action seems to be. This is with respect to both breast and prostate cancers. There's more information from other studies that's somewhat supportive in prostate cancer. Avoid large amounts of processed foods. I didn't show you that, but in our data, if we divide both the vegetarian or the non-vegetarian diets to contain more or less processed foods, those with high processed foods don't do as well with mortality. Fish obtained from clean waters appears safe and possibly particularly beneficial in the elderly for neurologic health. Now, this is somewhat speculative. Long-chain omega-3 is not found in the usual plants. It's found in alga in the ocean, but that's not what we usually eat. And yet DHA, one of the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, is the most prominent fat structurally in the brain. Eggs are also probably reasonably healthy in small quantities. They're a good source of choline, possibly necessary for brain health. We're investigating that now with respect to dementia in the Medicare population. So I could summarize that North American Adventists are living longer and better. And this seems to be particularly by the prevention of premature deaths. And the older people, the advantages and cardiac and diabetic and renal deaths are somewhat offset by apparent disadvantages neurologically. So these diets are delivering people into their 80s, but may then be not so optimal for neurological endpoints. The lifestyle, especially diet, affects a broad array of risk factors, and this translates to fewer deaths, particularly from those that I've just mentioned, certain cancers, not all cancers. So my overall conclusions are that nutrition and lifestyle affect life expectancy and disease risk in major ways, and dietary patterns, but probably also specific foods, are important, and we've just focused on nuts, dairy, omega-3, but there are probably others. We can say that the fluids bathing the cells of vegans are substantially different to those of non-vegetarians. And nutrition is complex, and there are age-related transitions in metabolism and how well you absorb B12, how well your skin makes vitamin D, for instance, and probably a bunch of others. So nutrition disease associations probably are also age-dependent. What's going on with the vegetarian habits and neurological diseases in the elderly? We don't know, but we believe that exciting findings remain to be found. So Mr. Spock said it well: live long and prosper. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just exit the video. That was incredibly illuminating. We've already had some wonderful questions come in, so I'll just kick off with those. There are some quite specific questions. I'll kick off with this one. The results that you shared on vegetarian and vegan diets and cancer incidence, will those results be published soon? And for those analyses, were there similar adjustments as in your previous published analyses?
Yes, good question. And I should have mentioned that they are submitted to a good nutritional journal at this moment. We're awaiting reviewers' comments, we hope. They were largely adjusted in the same way, but what we did, we looked at the World Cancer Research Fund recommendations for each individual cancer site and made sure we adjusted for all of the demographic variables that one would expect, but also we adjusted for any of the World Cancer Research Fund's update results for that particular cancer. In other words, any known or suspected risk factors for that particular cancer we adjusted.
Okay, thank you. This question is from Brenda Davis, who I think needs no introduction, but hi, Brenda, lovely to have you joining us. Do you recommend microalgae, DHA, EPA supplementation for vegans and vegetarians, basically anyone who's not eating fish? And if so, how much would you recommend based on if you're aware of the data around this?
Yeah. Now, this is an area in which we do not have totally strong data, although there are actually a couple of randomized trials that suggest that the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids may be helpful in dementia risk, but the data is not totally consistent. But I think from a number of standpoints, it just makes sense because as far as we know, there's not a lot of adverse consequences in doing this. Now, whether you should use algal or not is a little controversial, but there is some recent information actually from basic science that the algal, and I think I get this right, is not phosphatidyl choline, no, phosphatidyl combined with the DHA. It's a more direct DHA and crosses the blood-brain barrier in a more successful way. So there appears to be no downside, and I am actually switching to algal DHA personally myself. How much? I think the combination of DHA and EPA somewhere in the range of 1,000, 1,500 is safe. To go much higher, there is a little bit of information that higher doses of these long-chain omega-3s may be associated with a slightly increased risk of atrial fibrillation. And that's perhaps not totally surprising because you potentially affect the cell walls of cells throughout our body by altering your fatty acid intake in a major way, because you remember the lipid layers include fatty acids. I'm suggesting that one does not go higher than about 1,500 from the now that the total omega-3s might be higher than that. You've got to look at the combination of EPA plus DHA, which is only a part of the total fatty acids.
And one thing you did mention is, even things like vitamin D, obviously it depends on how much your skin absorbs. As a darker skinned South Asian person myself, it's going to be far less than yourself. And from the studies that you've done, what do you have any kind of conclusions or takeaways that you'd have for other ethnic groups? And obviously we can't lump all other ethnic groups in together, but I just wondered if there's anything that's been kind of done around that to see how this data may change or how the takeaways might apply to people of color.
Yeah, look, I don't think I can be authoritative about that, but I can say a couple of things. First of all, I mean, there's some information actually from the literature that vitamin D to get adequate levels might be helpful for neurologic health. In fact, and you've got to be a little bit careful because a lot of the studies that have been done nearly all of them actually have used fixed doses of vitamin D without measuring the consequences for serum levels. And it turns out that people are very variable in the way they respond. So if you just use, say, 2,000 international units or something like that, some people that's going to drive them up to a very adequate level. For many others, it's not. And so we don't have a lot of good studies where we actually measure the vitamin D response levels. The one thing I can say as far as other ethnicities, and really I've got no information to offer, unfortunately, about South Asians, but interestingly, in African Americans and presumably African populations as well, their vitamin D levels are relatively low, as you might expect, but their bone health, if anything, appears to be stronger than other groups. So they're metabolically different in some way. And certainly in terms of bone health, which is perhaps only one area where vitamin D is helpful, but very important area, and the one where there is, I think, pretty adequate proof. The people with darker skin do not appear to be challenged due to that.
Yeah, it's I feel like that area is quite complex. One thing I did come across, it's a smaller study, showed that South Asians appeared to be better converters of ALA, alpha linoleic acid, into DHA and EPA. It was a smaller study, but I'll share it with you following the presentation. But I did think that was quite interesting, and it might explain, or might indicate as might be one possible reason why we don't see such high levels of these diseases in places like India, for example. But it's just a possible thought. Another question: can you explain why pesco-vegetarians had a higher risk of dementia than vegans or lacto-ovo-vegetarians among those aged over 65?
Yeah, that's a good question that comes up, and the answer is no, I cannot, except to say that was particularly evident, I think, in the younger deaths, and we had relatively few events. You'll notice on that particular result that the error bars are really rather wide, and we often overlook that. But what that really means that if we were to redo this, if we had that capacity, it may be that that result would look very different. In other words, the fact that it looked like they had, as I recall, about a 35 or 40% increase, next time we did it, it could have been that they had a 5% decrease. So I wouldn't read too much into that, but it is an interesting observation nevertheless, and not in line with what we've said about the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And lots of questions coming in, which is great. Did you look at ultra-processed food consumption within the vegetarian and vegan groups? And if so, did you distinguish between the types of ultra-processed foods? Obviously, there are some ultra-processed foods that might be categorized as highly processed, such as tofu, and obviously that'd be quite different to ultra-processed foods such as pastries or ready meals or those kinds of foods. Was that looked into in more detail?
We have the information to do that. We have published a paper looking at ultra-processed diets that focused on ultra-processed content and those that less so. And interestingly showed that there was about a 15% that was significant increase in total mortality in diets that focused more on the ultra-processed foods. And we did not yet look at particular components of the ultra-processed, for instance, meat analogs, which would be really interesting because a lot of them are pretty processed. But we did look at the question separately in vegetarians and non-vegetarians, and we found that the answers were almost identical. So in other words, there are good and bad vegetarian diets, as well as good and bad non-vegetarian diets, although the vegetarian diets as a group hang better than the non-vegetarian diets.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the other questions that came up, looking specifically at the association between meat substitutes and health outcomes, because there's been such little data published about this previously. But something that was flagged by this question is that most of the data does suggest no or a slight inverse association. What's your hypothesis on that, or your thoughts about that? Obviously, not all meat alternatives are created equal. There can be quite a big difference in some of the ingredients that are used. You'll see things like, coconut oil in various amounts or different levels of certain nutrients. But I've just wondered your thoughts and on what the evidence is that you've seen around this.
Yeah, well, of course, it's a little bit difficult to pick apart vegetarianism as a group from ultra-processed as a group, because I think to some extent, one is coding for the other. I mean, vegetarian diets, although there's certainly the possibility of having vegetarian diets that major in pastries and pies and white flour and all these kind of things, in general, people that are motivated to become vegetarians are somewhat health conscious and know a little bit about what they're doing. And so I think to some extent, the ultra processed question is mixed up with the plant-based question. And remember that our non-vegetarian group is still a pretty health conscious kind of group. But so I think that, the whole question of why ultra processed is not good is pretty hard to pull apart from the question of saturated fat, trans fat, lots of simple carbohydrates, overweight, and so forth. I mean, I think you could come up with a variety of hypotheses as to why ultra-processed foods are not as good as natural foods in general.
And so you haven't broken down kind of the various types of vegetarian diets with regards to causes to death in terms of which ones have higher risk, that you haven't kind of gone into that level of granular detail so far.
Well, we have, but not
Even
in
further,
relation to the ultra processing.
yeah, even
No.
further, without just the label, I suppose, of when we say vegan diet, there could be someone eating a lot of ultra processed foods in there, but also somebody who is has a diet very rich in whole plant foods. So that the label is kind of covering both of those types of eaters.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the weaknesses of the labels of vegetarian, non-vegetarian, even vegan, lacto-ovo, because you're focusing on what? Dairy, eggs, and meat.
Yeah.
And within that, all the other foods you're ignoring, and yet they can be critically important in some cases. And in some ways, it's surprising that we have the findings that we do. Just suggests that the things we are focusing on really have some importance.
Great. So cheese and yogurt, this has come up a few times in questions. What's your hypothesis for the increased risk of breast and prostate cancer with that? Is there a link with probiotics in yogurt, for example, being beneficial for the non-increased risk? Is it the probiotics that could be present? Is that a possible, reason? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. We have not looked much at, the bacterial composition of the bowel. We've done, it's not published actually, we've got one analysis that was carefully looking at, variety of organisms in the bowel, comparing vegetarians and non-vegetarians. And actually the interesting thing was we could not demonstrate any difference. But I mean, one hypothesis that we've explored, and we really only came up with two, is that dairy products, and particularly milk, of course, do contain bovine sex hormones and metabolites of those. Relatively small quantities, but they're easily measurable. And if you go to our papers, I've provided a number of references. And remember, we're talking about people who are consuming perhaps relatively small quantities, half, 2/3 a cup a day, but they've probably been doing it for decades. And so we think that the bovine hormone hypothesis is certainly viable. We also wonder about the IGF-1 as another mediator of dairy milk. Now, your question was, what's different about cheese and yogurt? There is data, and again, I'll provide a reference, that the bovine hormones become degraded in the process of making cheese. And so one can argue that their levels are probably lower in that. Under that hypothesis, it's somewhat explainable. Yogurt, it's maybe the same kind of thing. I'm not so clear on that. We don't really know. And of course, the other thing is that the quantities of yogurt that were consumed by our population were not very large. I wouldn't say it was a great test as to, what would happen if people were having a cup of yogurt a day or something of that sort. It could be quite different.
Thank you. That's really helpful. A point that's been made is around B12 in the Adventist Health Study, which you rightly pointed out is so important for everyone, but especially if you're on a plant-based diet to supplement with that. And I just wondered if you could share some of the findings around that, specifically around B12. The person has made a point that 15.2% of vegans and 10.6% of lacto-vegetarians had intakes of vitamin B12 below the recommended daily allowance. And I believe this is Dr. Tim Raddock, who's been on our podcast as well to discuss this, and I think is also based at Loma Linda University. So yeah, just wondered your thoughts on B12 in a bit more detail and the difference between vegans and lacto.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, we've looked at B12 in the vegans and the different vegetarian dietary groups. And on average, if we compare means across those groups, we find no significant difference. But, this is a pretty well-educated population. And we find that most of or I shouldn't say most, but many of our vegans were supplementing. The only thing that we could say is that if one looked at the tail end, the low tail end of that, there was a group of vegans and lactose who were almost certainly deficient. And even though presumably the supplementers maybe dragged the mean up, I still suspect that there is a group, even in our population, that's relatively well educated, who are at risk because they are not supplementing. So that's really as far as we've gone in our data. But B12 deficiency, particularly in older people, is well known to have very adverse consequences. But it usually takes a relatively extreme diet to bring out, full-blown pernicious anemia. But whether there are more subtle effects on cognition and so forth, I don't think we know, but that's possible.
Thank you. I've just launched a really quick poll before I ask the last question. Were the breast and prostate cancers associated with milk significant? Is there thinking that some DCIS and low-grade prostate cancers often don't cause problems and treating them could cause more harm than leaving them alone?
I'm sorry, I missed just the last part of that.
It was, is there any thinking that some DCIS and low-grade prostate cancers often don't cause problems and treating them could cause more harm than leaving them alone? Were the types of cancer kind of, it was the severity and the grading?
Oh, I think that's probably true. First of all, the data that we have is highly significant. In other words, what that tells us from a statistical point of view, we're not talking about something which is just chance that's coming up here. Something biologic is going on. I think your question is this practically significant? Should we therefore do something about it? Well, we did look at more advanced stages of prostate cancer. And again, the numbers were small, so statistical significance wasn't quite achieved, but the trends looked the same, even in the more advanced cases, or very similar. We also looked in our African American subjects where, as you possibly know, there's about double the risk of prostate cancer, and that was true in the Adventists as well. But again, the relationship with dairy seemed to be the same. There was kind of differences in the range of 50%. Now, so the question arises, treatment. Well, that's not something, I guess, that I'm totally competent to talk about, but here we're talking about prevention. And so the question is, are the things that we're advocating going to increase risk in some way? And as far as we know, for instance, substituting plant-based milks, perhaps not those that are too heavily ultra-processed, for dairy milk, is not associated with any higher risk. And therefore, many might think that it's the prudent thing to do.
And yeah, plenty of benefits from having soya milk, plenty of beneficial phytoestrogens and other properties as well. And of course, sustainability is a factor for lots of consumers as well. So wonderful. Thank you so much. I not apologize, but I definitely asked you some pretty intense questions in the Q&A. So thank you so much. I know everyone found it incredibly helpful. And yeah, I would love if you could just share a little bit about how you divide your time. When we've been writing back and forth, you very kindly agreed to do this webinar from New Zealand, where you said that you spend some proportion of your time and that the picture behind you was taken on one of your hikes, which is amazing. So yeah, I'd love if you could share that. We have people joining today from Canada, the US, Singapore, the UK, all over, so very global attendees.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I split my time and have done throughout my career roughly 50-50 between epidemiologic research and cardiology, and that continues. I'm kind of an old guy. I'll be 80 at my next birthday, and so I am semi-retired. And we decided about 20 years ago we wanted to end up back where I began to some extent in New Zealand. So I've been very, very fortunate actually that my university at Loma Linda has managed to accommodate this. And when I'm here in New Zealand, I'm actually working pretty hard, but it's only on research. My medical license I've let lapse here, but when I'm back in California, I'm doing a lot of cardiology practice, but still I'm directing a small group of scientists who are working on the Adventist Health Study data. And I find it 3 months about in either place is frankly a crazy way to live, but it suits us pretty well and gives a good deal of variety and a little bit more relaxation when I'm back here.
Just wonderful. Yeah, such a beautiful country. And you certainly sound like you keep very busy when you're back in the US, and it's juggling lots of different things. And as someone has said, they can't believe you're 80, firstly. And the second thing is you're very good at explaining complex things, which I think is a huge compliment. And yeah, thank you so much, because this is definitely something that when I saw the paper in 2024, I've had questions about ever since, and I'm sure many of the people here listening or listening to the recording also did. So you've really cleared up a lot of confusion. So thanks again. And thank you, everyone. Our webinar next month is not up on the site yet, but it will be the 30th of April, and we're going to be discussing all the different pillars of lifestyle medicine. We didn't get a chance to touch on that, but there are other areas such as exercise and sleep and other things that really do play a very important role in overall health as well as neurological health. So I do hope you'll join us. Thank you so much, and special thanks to you, especially Gary, and for doing this on your time off in New Zealand as well. Thank you.
My pleasure.